October 1943. The Atlantic Ocean, a vast and unforgiving expanse of dark, churning waters. The skies above were thick with the promise of war. The sun hung low, casting a pale orange glow on the waves as the hum of engines cut through the eerie silence of the deep. On board the USS Mason, a ship brimming with young men from all walks of life, a storm of its own was brewing. They were far from home, hundreds of miles from the harbors of the United States, and they were on a mission that would test their mettle like no other. This ship, unlike most others in the U.S. Navy, was manned by a predominantly black crew, a crew that had faced discrimination and doubt since the moment they enlisted. But now, in the heart of the Atlantic, in the deadliest waters of World War II, they were about to prove that nothing, no prejudice, no storm, no U-boat could stand in their way in the middle of the vast ocean. With enemy submarines lurking just below the surface, the Mason was part of the 1943 convoy that sailed through the treacherous waters of the North Atlantic. The U-boats had become a nightmare for Allied shipping. Their deadly, silent attacks, like sharks hunting in the murky depths, sank countless merchant ships, cutting off vital supplies and reinforcements. The German Kriegsmarine's U-boats were feared for their deadly efficiency. But now, in the bitter cold of the Atlantic winter, they would face an enemy unlike any other. The Mason was a destroyer escort, one of the smaller ships in the fleet, but crucial nonetheless. Her job was to protect the convoys from U-boat attacks. Her crew, most of whom were black sailors, young men who had trained under the shadow of segregation, who had faced immense challenges even before boarding this vessel, were about to embark on one of the most remarkable chapters of naval history. For many, the very existence of the Mason was a testament to the courage of those who had fought for the right to serve their country in uniform. Despite facing systemic racism and being denied opportunities in the Navy, black men had persevered. The Mason was their ship, a symbol of resilience in the face of adversity. But this was more than just a story of triumph against racism. It was a story of battle, of survival, and of extraordinary heroism. The men of the Mason would soon find themselves in a life and death struggle with the unseen enemy of the Atlantic, the German U-boat, on this particular day. The sea was calm, but the tension was palpable. The Mason was tasked with escorting a convoy carrying crucial supplies for the war effort. But unknown to them, a German U-boat was lying in wait just beneath the surface. These were not just any sailors aboard the Mason. They were men with a mission. And in the midst of this tense convoy operation, as radar pulses scanned the endless expanse of ocean, a sound cut through the air, the shrill, unmistakable alarm of a submarine contact. The Mason crew had been trained for this moment. This was no drill. The U-boat was approaching, its engines humming beneath the surface, its crew preparing for a torpedo strike. The men of the Mason scrambled to their stations, their movements swift and deliberate. The sound of gunfire echoed across the ship as they raced to bring their weapons into action. This was what they had trained forth. This was what they had come for. And yet, despite their readiness, there was still doubt. Their courage, their determination, and their skill would be tested in the most unforgiving of environments. The U-boat was closing in. Aboard the Mason, Commander George R. Phillips, a man who had risen through the ranks despite the limitations of racial barriers, stood firm at the helm. He was a black man commanding a ship, and that in itself was a victory. The crew knew what they were up against, that just the U-boats. But the decades of prejudice that had shadowed their every step. Phillips, undeterred by the weight of history, guided his ship and crew into the fray. The Mason's crew had trained rigorously. Each sailor knew his role. Each task was performed with precision. They had to be ready, and they were. The destroyer's sonar systems pinged in rapid succession, detecting the underwater menace as it maneuvered in for its strike. The crew was prepared for the inevitable attack. The torpedoes came, cutting through the cold, dark water, but the sailors of the Mason were ready. They fired back. The battle for survival had begun. On the deck, sailors manned their guns, their faces grim with focus. The Mason fired its first salvo at the submerged U-boat, the explosion shaking the ship as the waves splashed against her hull. Smoke billowed from the depth charges as the ship's guns roared to life, sending tracer rounds streaking across the ocean. A quiet murmur of satisfaction rippled through the crew. This was not just a battle for survival. It was a fight for recognition. They had earned their place here, and they would not be silenced by the prejudice of their past. The battle raged on for what felt like hours, the cold spray of the Atlantic stinging their faces as they manned their posts. The Mason's crew was relentless. They had no choice. Each shot fired was a statement. Each U-boat that slipped beneath the waves was a victory, not just for the men of the Mason, but for every black man who had ever been told he couldn't serve. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the U-boat retreated, wounded but alive, disappearing into the depths. The crew of the Mason had struck the first blow in a series of victories that would prove to the world, to themselves, that their determination, their courage, and their unity were stronger than the forces that sought to divide them. The convoy continued on its way, but for the men of the Mason, the victory was personal. They had fought the enemy and proven their worth, not just as sailors, but as men. They had faced down a deadly foe, and in the process, they had earned a place in the annals of history. The Mason would go on to sink multiple U-boats, earning the admiration of Allied forces and proving that the men of the U.S. Navy's first all-black crew were more than capable. They were champions. The Battle of the Atlantic, with its silent underwater threats, had changed. The Mason had entered the fight, and with them, the power of equality, skill, and resilience. This was more than a victory over the enemy. It was a victory over a system that had tried to keep these men from becoming heroes. The men of the Mason had not only conquered the waters of the Atlantic, they had conquered history itself. And though their names might not be as well known as those of the ships they fought alongside, their victory was no less significant. As the waves continued to crash against the hull of the USS Mason, the men knew this. They had given the Atlantic, and the world, a new definition of heroism. The story of the USS Mason does not end with a single victory, nor does it end with the sinking of enemy U-boats. What transpired in the months following their first encounter was a testament to the sheer endurance and skill of a crew that had been underestimated, not just by the Axis powers, but by their own country. The Mason's success was not just tactical, it was a psychological turning point, a spark in the dark waters of racial segregation that would ripple across the broader narrative of wartime America. After that initial battle, the Mason would go on to serve with distinction in the Atlantic, participating in convoy protection operations from the Caribbean to the icy waters of the northern Atlantic. Their primary task was to provide protection for merchant vessels, many of which were essential lifelines to the war effort. The convoy system, a vital strategy to keep Allied forces supplied, relied heavily on the constant threat of U-boat attacks. The men aboard the Mason faced this threat daily, each patrol a potential life-or-death encounter with the enemy. The U-boats, sleek and silent, hunted their targets with ruthless precision. But the Mason's crew had found a rhythm, one of coordination, timing, and sheer willpower. The Mason's radar systems, constantly refined by the efforts of Allied engineers, were now functioning at peak efficiency. These systems, with their pulse transmission and frequency modulation capabilities, were designed to detect enemy vessels lurking just beneath the surface of the water. But the U-boats were not their only challenge. As they navigated the perilous waters of the Atlantic, the crew was also tasked with keeping up the morale of the men who had never before seen combat on this scale. They faced exhaustion, fear, and the constant threat of attack from above and below. But through it all, the leadership of Commander Phillips, who had grown to become an iconic figure among his crew, kept them focused. His calm, authoritative demeanor steadied the crew during the darkest moments. But it wasn't just Phillips' leadership that kept the Mason afloat. It was the men themselves. The crew of the Mason was diverse in their backgrounds, experiences, and cultures, yet the one thing that united them was their shared purpose. They were fighting not only for victory over the Axis powers, but for their dignity as human beings. Each success, each victory in battle, chipped away at the layers of racial prejudice they had long been subjected to. As the months passed, Their reputation grew both among their fellow soldiers and their superiors. In the final months of 1943, the Mason participated in a particularly harrowing convoy operation, the HX-239. This mission, one of the longest and most dangerous of the war, was critical for Allied operations in Europe. The convoy, carrying vital supplies, had become a prime target for the relentless German U-boats, who launched a full-scale attack on the fleet. It was here that the Mason would truly demonstrate what made it tanned, its crew unique. The U-boats had honed their tactics, making use of advanced communications and stealth. But they had underestimated the Mason as the convoy sailed into the Atlantic. The Mason led the charge, its radar slicing through the fog of war, hunting down U-boats with precision. In the midst of the battle, a U-boat surfaced, and the Mason's gunners sprang into action. The enemy submarine had been moving at a high rate of speed, its deck gun firing in a desperate attempt to disrupt the convoy. The crew of the Mason responded with deadly force. The gunners on deck, steady under pressure, fired back with rapid fire, striking the U-boat and forcing it to dive. But the Mason's crew didn't stop there. They circled, anticipating the U-boat's movements, cutting off its escape routes. It was a tactical maneuver that would become textbook material for naval warfare. The fight raged through the night. The ocean was a dark void, and every splash from the ships, every crackle of gunfire, echoed through the void of the Atlantic. The Mason fired depth charges, one after another, each explosion a warning to the lurking threat beneath the surface. The U-boat, shaken by the blasts, attempted to flee, but it was too late. With a well-placed shot, the Mason disabled the sub's propulsion system. The U-boat, crippled and unable to escape, sank to the bottom of the Atlantic. The Mason had struck again, as the convoy sailed safely to port. The Mason's victory was a testament to the crew's perseverance and ingenuity. It was also a turning point in the broader narrative of the U.S. Navy's war effort. The success of the Mason's crew sent a clear message. They had not only earned their place in the Navy, they had proven their mettle under fire. The victory over the U-boat wasn't just a tactical win, it was symbolic. The crew had fought against the enemy's deadliest weapon, and in doing so, had struck a blow against the very prejudices that had tried to keep them from serving. Back at the Navy's headquarters, officials began to take notice. The Mason was no longer just a ship with a crew of black men, it was a symbol of the future of the Navy. The men aboard the Mason had shown that the color of one's skin had nothing to do with courage, valor, or the ability to win a war. The ship would go on to complete several more successful missions before the war ended, each victory adding to the growing legend of the USS Mason and her crew. In 1944, as the war in Europe drew to a close, the Navy awarded the Mason's crew with a citation for their exemplary service. The crew of the Mason had proven to be an indomitable force, one that had earned the respect of their fellow sailors, their commanders, and their nation. Theirs was a story not only of military success, but of personal triumph. They had fought not only to protect their country, but to prove that all men, regardless of their race or background, could serve with honor. Yet, despite their successes, the story of the Mason's crew would be largely forgotten in the decades that followed. The victories they won in the Atlantic, the battles they fought on behalf of freedom, were overshadowed by the racial tensions that still gripped the country. But in the hearts of those who served aboard the Mason, the memory of their triumphs remained a constant reminder that against all odds, they had not only defeated the enemy, they had defeated the prejudice that had sought to keep them from the fight. The legacy of the USS Mason crew lives on not just in the pages of history books, but in the continued struggle for equality, dignity, and respect. Their fight, both on the battlefield and within the confines of their own country, paved the way for future generations of Black Americans to serve their country with honor and pride. The Mason was more than just a ship, it was a symbol of perseverance, of courage, and of the enduring power of unity in the face of adversity. The legacy of the USS Mason's crew didn't end with the war. While many of the men returned to civilian life after the conflict, their story remained unfinished in the broader narrative of American military history. The ship's contributions to the Navy were largely overshadowed by the racism and prejudice that continued to exist within the armed forces and across American society. Yet, despite this, the sailors of the Mason had proven something far more powerful, that their heroism could not be erased by history's negligence. The years following the war brought with them new battles this time, not on the front lines, but in the streets, in courtrooms, and in the halls of government. The men of the Mason had shown the world their worth in combat. But as they returned to a civilian world still reeling from the effects of segregation, they were forced to fight for recognition and respect. Many of them, having been heroes in the Atlantic, returned to a society where they were still considered second-class citizens. Barred from the benefits of full participation in American life, the GI Bill, which promised educational and economic benefits to veterans, was often denied to black servicemen. Black veterans returning from the war had to continue to fight not just for their place in the military, but for their place in society. Yet in the face of this continued struggle, the spirit of the USS Mason's crew never faltered. Their experience having faced down enemies both foreign and domestic had prepared them for the battles that awaited them in post-war America. The men who had once fought to protect their country would now fight to redefine their place within it. The government, for its part, began to take notice of the importance of the Mason's crew in the broader context of American history. In 1971, the Mason was finally recognized by the U.S. Navy with the Navy Unit Commendation, one of the highest honors a naval ship and its crew can receive. This recognition, however, came long after the ship had finished its wartime duties, and it served as a reminder that even the most extraordinary contributions could be forgotten, relegated to the margins of history. The men of the Mason had fought, bled, and survived for their country, but it had taken decades for their country to acknowledge their sacrifice. As time passed, the story of the USS Mason and her crew became a symbol not just of naval prowess, but of the slow march toward racial integration and equality in the military. The Mason's success was a harbinger of the changes that would slowly begin to take root in the armed forces, especially during and after the Civil Rights Movement. The men of the Mason had proven that no matter their race, they were capable of the same heroism, sacrifice, and skill as any other American sailor. They had earned their place in history no longer as soldiers of segregation, but as soldiers of victory. In 2000, the USS Mason was commemorated in a more tangible way. The ship's bell, a symbol of the crew's legacy, was placed in the National Museum of African American History and Culture. The bell stood as a tribute to the sacrifices made by the men of the Mason, and to the countless others who had served in World War II, fighting not just for victory over the Axis, but for the victory of equality in their own country. The bell, with its deep resonating toll, serves as a constant reminder that the fight for freedom and justice is never truly over. The USS Mason's crew had fought their battle in the Atlantic. Now their victory rang out across generations. But even this, recognition decades after the war, was not the final chapter of the Mason's story. The story of the men who sailed her was immortalized not just in official records, but in the stories passed down from father to son, from uncle to nephew, from friend to friend. For the families of those who served aboard the Mason, their legacy continued to live on, not just as a military achievement, but as a moral victory, one that proved that heroism could not be defined by the color of one's skin. The Mason had been the first step in a long journey toward equality in the Navy, and the men aboard had laid the groundwork for the future of all black Americans who would follow in their footsteps. Today, the story of the USS Mason is one that has come to symbolize both the courage of the black servicemen who fought in World War II and the resilience of a nation that was forced to confront its own contradictions. The war may have ended, but the fight for freedom, both in the Atlantic and at home, continued. For those who served aboard the Mason, the battles fought were not only against the enemy, but against the systemic racism that sought to prevent them from serving their country. They had fought for the right to serve. They had fought for the right to be heroes. As the years passed, the Mason and her crew became more than just a historical footnote. They became a living testament to the power of perseverance, to the belief that no matter the odds, one could overcome anything with courage and conviction. Their legacy continues to inspire not just the men and women who serve in the military today, but all who fight for justice, equality, and the right to be recognized for who they truly are. The USS Mason had been part of a battle that had changed the course of history. But its greatest victory was one that would be felt long after the final shots were fired in the Atlantic. The crew of the Mason had shown that, in the end, it wasn't just the enemy that could be defeated, it was the prejudice that had once kept them from being seen as equals in the eyes of their own nation. And so, in the calm, reflective waters of history, the toll of the USS Mason's bell continues to echo, a reminder that the true victory of war is not simply in the defeat of enemies abroad, but in the battle for dignity, equality, and the recognition of every individual's worth, regardless of race, rank, or origin. The victory of the Mason was not just a military triumph, it was a victory for the soul of the nation.